now we have an hour-long panel on critical minerals, source, extraction, and downstream. And I've got three people representing different aspects of that from the BRC. We've got Paul Gow from chemical engineering. We've got James Vaughan, and from the Center for Policy Futures, we've got Lynette Molyneaux. And what I thought I'd start by is just hand around the mic and get each of you to introduce yourself and tell people why you're here.
Get someone else started.
Paul, you can start if you want. You're the source guy.
Okay, thank you. Yes, look, my name is Paul Gow. I'm here at the Bryan Research Centre. I'm a geologist. We've been doing a lot of work that I'm going to talk briefly about soon on critical minerals, particularly here in Queensland. They're becoming more and more important these days, and we certainly see that reflected in both policy and what we see in the media, etc. So that's why I'm here today.
Okay, hi, I'm James Vaughan. I'm Associate Professor in Chemical Engineering and Metallurgical Engineering, and specifically in hydrometallurgy. And we have a facility at the Long Pocket, is where our research labs are at the moment. And I've been collaborating with Rick and Paul and Gordon on this Queensland State Government Rare Earth project. So I guess I can talk to that a little bit more in a minute.
So I'm Lynette Molyneaux with the Centre for Policy Futures, and what we do is we try and actually interpret what you guys do for governments. So I've been banging on doors for the last year, presenting the Queensland government with the fantastic opportunity that is associated not only with the extraction of the complex ore bodies et al., but also with what can happen if we head on upstream, downstream, sorry, I keep getting it wrong, downstream in terms of the manufacturing capacity that it would provide for Queensland specifically in terms of the huge opportunity that's unfolding around the world.
Could you pass that back to Paul? So what I was going to do now is just get each person to, I should have done it probably while you were introducing yourself, to talk in a little bit more detail about your connection, in your case, Paul, with the source. I can run the slides if that makes life easier. But
yep, that'd be great. Oh, thanks, Rick. Yep, I have about 4 or 5 slides. I can talk briefly. So what I wanted to talk about was the source of critical metals, and it's obviously important, as Lynette was talking about, trying to encourage an industry, for example, in Queensland, and you can't really do that unless you have a source of minerals in a mining sense in the state, unless you're more downstream, where you can obviously import your product. Thanks, Rick. If you could step on to the next one. So given it's a panel, I'm not going to talk so much about the work that we've been doing, but I guess talk some general discussion points. So the first I put up is this diagram, and it's from the 2020 study of the EU's critical raw materials, where basically they go back every year or two, I think, and have a think about what they will put on their critical materials list. And you'll see some of the things that we've heard about this morning on this plot. On the y-axis is the supply risk, and along the bottom is the economic importance. And so essentially you'll see those 2 lines there that delineate what are called the critical raw materials in the red points, and then the others that are either lower supply risk or lower economic importance are there in blue. So this is how those critical raw materials are denoted as critical minerals or critical metals or new economy minerals or forward-facing metals or whatever you want to call them. There's some pretty interesting things on here that you've put in there. You can see on the right-hand side, there's natural rubber down there at the bottom of the supply risk. And there's things like coking coal, which is right down in the bottom left of the red space. And then there's the high supply risk elements up there, the rare earths and germanium, and then there's the high economic importance, things like tungsten, etc. So I just wanted to put that up as a bit of a look. Thanks, Rick. And you've probably all seen this this plot. It's commonly flashed up. It essentially it's from the same report, the EU 2020 review of critical minerals, and basically what it's showing is the largest share of global supply of the critical raw materials from various countries. And you'll see Australia gets a Guernsey there, providing 28% of the global supply of bauxite. But then what you see is there are various countries around here that have a lot of critical minerals, particularly South Africa and China, with very heavy global production numbers. For example, 92% of iridium from South Africa, and I think something like about 86% of rare earths from China, for example. And so that's the source or supply risk that makes these things plot as critical minerals. Thanks, Rick. So that's I guess looking at the geography of critical mineral sources. And the other thing to have a look at that we've been working with is geology. And of course, geography and geology are pretty intimately related. But what I wanted to show here, and this is just two of the metals we've been working with, scandium and cobalt. And what you can see here is production versus resources. Okay. And thanks Katerina for these scandium diagrams that she's put together. So what you can see in production is that the Bayan-Obo carbonatite in China really dominates production of global scandium, okay? And then if you look at cobalt, production of cobalt, it's very much dominated by three different types of deposits, okay? The stratiform, the nickel cobalt laterite, and the magmatic deposits. But what I find incredibly interesting is that's production, okay? But when you look at resources, the thing is totally different, okay? So can you flick on to the next one? Thanks, Rick. Okay, so on production up the top there, on the top left, you'll see that grey area is the carbonatites. But when you look at resources, the carbonatites on the top right hand there is that tiny little wedge of resources, okay? And most of the scandium resources, and this is not resources in an economic term as the mining industry uses, but generally resources in concentrations, the mafic, ultramafic intrusions are about 95% of global scandium resource. And likewise, if you look at cobalt, 100% of the cobalt production is, for example, from three, or 90% is from three deposit types, and they're all terrestrial, okay? But when you look at the resources, that 100% of production of cobalt ties into probably about 20% of what's sort of termed the global resource. So what I take these plots to be saying is that current production may not be a particular predictor of where your production will come from in the future in terms of your types of mineral deposits, and of course where those mineral deposits are located geographically. So that we have to be very careful about the status quo and extrapolating it into the future. Next one, thanks, Rick. Now, just to highlight a couple of the projects that we're working on. Excuse me, turning around like this to have a look at the screen. But we're currently, I guess, working or completing three key projects. One of them is funded by Complex Ore Bodies. That's the rare earths processing project, which I assume James will probably tell us a bit more about shortly. The other two we're looking at, we've completed a atlas of mineral deposits very much focused on tin and tungsten and nickel and scandium and cobalt in northeastern Queensland. And we've also undertaken a targeting exercise for new economy minerals in Queensland. You'll see some of them that have come out there: tungsten, rare earths, scandium, cobalt, and silica. And the aim of that project is to encourage people and to make a better understanding for people of where they might want to look in Queensland for these new economy minerals. And I should note on the bottom right-hand side there, you'll see the Queensland government logo. All three of these projects are funded by the Queensland government. So that's a bit of a background to my involvement and the SMI's involvement in sources of critical metals. Thanks. James.
All right, thanks, Paul. And I'm just going to hand over to James now. And I should say, I made slides optional, so don't think that James and Lynette were slack because they didn't do slides. I said bring slides if you want. No need to have them. So thanks for that, Paul. And James, yeah, I just wanted to. I know that you've been involved in working on critical metal extraction for quite a long time now, you and your team, and so I'd really be interested to hear sort of what the breadth is of the work that your team's been doing in this space.
Yeah. Okay. Sure. Thanks. So, I guess in the past we've done quite a bit of work on nickel and cobalt and separating nickel from cobalt and lots of novel process options in that area. So that's been kind of a consistent theme in the group for about 10 years. And then recently we've been working on the Queensland state government initiative to kind of figure out where the rare earths are in Queensland, and rare earths are not necessarily all that rare in terms of grades when you compare to like platinum, for example. So they are kind of all over the place in a sense, but you know, how do you get them efficiently? It becomes a big challenge. So at the start of the project, we kind of surveyed. We had a quite extensive list of all the possible sources in Queensland of rare earths, and then we kind of tried to prioritize them, make a short list, and then went out and got some samples in northern Queensland, and brought those back. And so I guess a couple of the projects which have kind of passed a few hurdles and gotten to the processing side are the tailings at Mary Kathleen. So Mary Kathleen was a uranium mine which operated over a number of years in the, I think, late 50s and 1970s. And then so in that situation, the uranium, which was the product at the time, was leached out, and the rare earths kind of stayed, and some of them precipitated onto the tailings, and then those were stored away. So at the time, even though there's pretty reasonable grade of rare earths, the markets are not developed for those things. So so that means there wasn't demand. So they just didn't bother getting them as a product. But they're all sitting there in one place and fine the ground material. Yeah, quite high concentration, quite large amount. So I think that's one of the more interesting deposits. So we've done some conventional hydrometallurgy to extract that, and so the next challenge when you come to extracting is, you know, the cost of the reagent. Usually it's the cost of acid. So it's the concentration of rare earths, but the concentration of acid soluble gangue minerals that are there as well. So we're taking a very close look and to see how those systems work, and we do have quite nice recoveries, I believe, in reasonable acid utilization. So that's looking quite promising. The second interesting project was around the rare earths that are on the phosphate deposits, and Queensland has a fairly extensive reserve of phosphates. And phosphates rare earths are complicated because there's about 14 of them. So there's lights and heavies, and depending on the ratio of the two is another factor that needs to be considered. So the uranium tailings have more lights, and the phosphate rock seems to have more heavies. There's Phosphate Hill is an existing refinery which processes rare earths. So they're interested in finding out where the rare earths actually go in their process. Do they end up in the fertilizer, for example? That's just put in the agriculture, and you get a little bit of rare earths in your vegetables, or are they in the tailings, or are they in some other stream where we can extract them? So that's an ongoing project to see if there's an efficient way of extracting rare earths from an existing process. And then there's a little bit more blue sky as to what if you had a new kind of phosphate process, what would you do, knowing up front that you were going to try to get rare earths and phosphate at the same time. So there's and yeah, I just looked at the list, and the phosphate was of reasonable economic importance, but not quite in supply drought now. But I guess associated with emerging energy markets, the lithium phosphate batteries are on the up as well. So maybe there's we can think about a new markets emerging for kind of high purity phosphate chemicals for that industry. So so there's lots of and in the hydromet processing, with the high purity chemicals required for the kind of the new economy in the technology sector, a lot of that has to be kind of high purity as well. So you can get to a kind of a crude first product typically, and then you have to separate the elements. With rare earths is a huge challenge actually, and requiring immense process intensity to separate the rare earths and then get specific rare earths products. So that's a challenging area. That's next year's problem, I think. And then getting high purity salts, high purity products. So in nickel and cobalt, for example, that the industry is completely set up for feeding the stainless steel industry. And that requires one type of process technology, but for the battery supply chain, you need different type of technology and different products and different purity limits. And so that's those are the types of challenges we can think about in hydromet research. So I think probably said enough and tried to set up Lynette maybe to.
Thanks, James. So Lynette, thanks again for coming in and mixing up with all these sort of source and extraction level people. And I'm really interested to hear in more detail about the work that you've been doing to try to foster a downstream industry in Queensland and more generally.
Yeah, sure. I'd just like to add is that James has another feather in his bow, which is actually that he provides an astonishing translation service for me, because I don't understand most of the stuff that he talks about. And certainly nobody in government does. So he kind of translates it for me, and then I go off to government and I can pretend I have even the slightest idea that what I'm talking about. So it's been finding James in the whole order of things has been astonishingly important in terms of being able to understand what is there, what is required, what can be possible, and how that translates into what's happening around the world. So I come at this from completely the other end, which is really all about the sort of market opportunity. And what you're looking at is that today, kind of the IEA's projections is that if we are to meet any of the net zero emissions targets by 2050, we have to invest in an enormous amount of energy infrastructure. So if you look at the areas that we could break that down into, in terms of oil, fuels, what the world spends at the moment is around about the $500 billion US dollars a year on fuels. That's going to increase slightly. But the interesting thing about all of that is that the increase will come almost entirely from hydrogen production, investment in hydrogen production. And that's kind of good for Queensland and for Australia, because we have the strategy and, we focused on it. So we're shifting to meet that opportunity. The second side is to look at electricity generation. And today we spend around about the $500 billion a year US on electricity generation. That's going to increase to about $1.6 trillion per year over the next decade. And that is kind of like all about photovoltaic cells and all the rest. But what is interesting for Queensland is that there will be around about the $80 billion a year that will be invested in battery storage, specifically for renewable energy. And what you need for renewable energy is longer storage duration, and that's great for Queensland because we have some great vanadium deposits. We have 3 industry proponents, maybe more, actually looking at extracting that vanadium and then taking it to varying stages of one company is looking at electrolytes, others are looking to go to the full vanadium, kind of control level. So they're actually there. So, that's quite good for Queensland as well. And then there's the third category, which is where we spend about sort of $78 billion US dollars a year on electrification of transport. And the projections are that to meet the NZE targets, we have to spend around $570 billion a year on electrification. And that sort of translates to a relatively small $44 billion a year on hydrogen fuel cells and a gigantic $370 billion a year on electric cars. And that $370 billion a year is not the car itself, but it's on the battery that effectively and the electrics that run it. So, why would you think that was important for Queensland? Because we're not going to get them because we've got too far to travel and we've got range anxiety. But certainly what's happened in Europe is that Europe is seeing that the only way that it can actually meet its climate ambition is to invest heavily and to drive the market for electric vehicles. So the benefit associated with that for us is that, where today the amount of copper that you require in a conventional car is around about 22 kilograms. You need 11 kilograms of manganese. For an electric vehicle, you need double that. You need 50 odd kilograms of copper. You need 20 odd kilograms, 25 odd kilograms of manganese. And then you need 9 kilograms of lithium, 13 kilograms of cobalt, 40 kilograms of nickel, and 66 kilograms of graphite. To reach the objectives of getting to 50 million EVs per year, all of the extraction, all of the processing, everything has to increase by an average of around 50%, 30% per year. I mean, the metals themselves differ in absolute capacity. Some are around 28%, some are around 35%, but everything has to increase around about 30% per year. So that is kind of important for Queensland, because whilst we don't have lithium, which is what most of the government have said to me, well, we don't have lithium, how can we participate in this fantastic opportunity? It is the kind of smallest metal in the process. You know, we have a huge requirement for graphite, and Queensland has graphite deposits, but nobody's really done anything about them yet. We have the cobalt copper deposits around Mount Isa, which could be, furthered. We have access to the laterite ores in New Caledonia, which could be brought on shore and processed in Townsville. And, so there's this fantastic opportunity that Queensland has, which is kind of more than just digging up ore in Queensland. It's really about processing on shore, and then actually kind of taking it to a stage where it is closer to the manufacturing capacity that would be required in Europe. Because Europe is investing heavily in lithium-ion battery factories. They've got 23 under development currently. They're going to go from virtually no capacity, maybe 2 years ago, to 368 gigawatt hours of capacity by 2025. And they have no feedstock in terms of, are you looking to watch because I've talked too much already?
No, that's fine. Very straight on. No, actually, I was thinking, oh yeah, we're gonna fill an hour, no problem. That's what I was thinking.
So just go like this when
No, it's fascinating. It's fantastic. Yeah. Now you've ruined the buzz.
So Europe is investing in it, and it doesn't really have the resources. And what they are constrained by is that most of the processing of all of these minerals today is actually done in China. So all of, there are multiple countries which serve as the sole or major supplier of a lot of these things, the DRC for cobalt, and Indonesia for nickel, and so it goes on. The reality is that all then heads up to China, and they are the major dominant supplier of processed metals from there on. So what Europe has an issue with is that if it's going to go into the market for electric vehicles, they already are in competition with China, which has an EV market. And the EV market in China has sort of grown organically with a lot of support from government to be what it is today. But they're actually going after the same market that the Europeans are doing now. So if Europe wants to establish, if we've got these massive increases in supply required to meet the demand, and Europe wants to establish itself as a credible competitor against, in the world generally, it really has to secure a supply chain, which is what Australia, and specifically Queensland, actually has, is the ability to be able to become a credible, reliable supply chain partner. So kind of, when you start that story with the Queensland government, they're all nodding, and they kind of look to you and they say, but we don't have lithium. And you say, well, we don't have to have lithium. We can import that because we've got some great tech. We've got this great tech that James is doing, which is all about getting really low carbon nickel and cobalt, and we can do it from places in the nearby areas. And we've got some really great stuff that's going on in terms of the conversion of all of the metals into a variety of lithium-ion battery chemistries, from LFP to a bunch of others as well, which go into lithium sulfur, and we've got aluminium ion. So we've got some really cool companies in Queensland, which have been spun out of universities, I think James has been responsible for one or two of them as well. And they're desperately trying to get underway. They want to establish their manufacturing and their processing plants in Queensland, but it's incredibly complicated to do that when you're at the end of the supply chain. You're a small organization. You haven't been, you don't have a balance sheet to actually support huge amounts of funding to develop something big and meaningful to transact with Europe. So my entire thesis with the Queensland government is that if you don't actually get in there and support these companies, they are seriously ahead of their game. They will go, because Western Australia is pretty keen. Singapore is pretty keen. Singapore is offering all sorts of credentials or opportunities. We'll give you 100% finance and you can move into an industrial park tomorrow, as long as you bring your business to Singapore. Canada's doing the same thing. They're actually after this market as well. They have hydro electricity, which allows them to meet all the sort of ESG credentials that Europe is going to have. So we need to kind of wake up and be more than just, gosh, we've got a few deposits down the road, maybe we'll dig those up and ship them overseas. Because the exercise that the FBI CRC did was that we could do that. But it's like about 13,000 jobs. If we supplied 30% of the world's lithium-ion battery critical minerals, it would be around 13,000 jobs. But if you attempt to do more than that, if you attempt to get to maybe half of that in terms of processing the metals, that would be maybe another 5,000 jobs. If you were to go to the chemical engineering processing of creating the battery precursors, you'd get another 5,000 jobs. And so it continues up the value chain. So if you were to do even a small, relatively unambitious approach to saying we won't do all of our deposits, we will give some away and we'll do all the rest, you get to 34,000 jobs. 43, somewhere around there. It's lots, 43,000 jobs. Now, the issue with that is that West Australia has got the idea, and West Australia is busy developing their processing facilities. They've got Kwinana as a nice little hub now. It's growing really big. So Queensland desperately needs to have a battery supply chain strategy. And I'm pleased to say that if any of you saw the resources industry development plan that came out last Thursday, it had one little line item in there, which is kind of the culmination of 12 months of banging on doors, which said, we will develop a battery industry strategy. So we're kind of there, but now we've got the long way to go to actually turn that into something which is more than just a one line item in a draft strategy plan. So I think that's where I'll leave it.
Good. All right. Could you pass back to Paul, actually? Thanks, Lynette. Yeah. So well, I'm going to ask two questions. The first one is, and I know we didn't do lithium as part of our compilation, because we specifically decided not to, or decided with the Queensland government not to. So my first question was going to be, do we really not have any lithium in Queensland, or we just not had a look? And then number two is then, what's holding back, in your opinion, after, we've been involved in worked on a lot of these compilations, what's holding back, additional critical minerals discovery in Queensland? What do we have to do to build that part of this broader equation?
Okay, I'll thank you, Rick. Yes, lithium. So lithium is typically, and I guess many people would be aware of this, is typically sourced from, I guess, two broad categories. One is the saline lake environments, particularly up in the Andes, is very, very common, and that's probably not the route for Queensland. But otherwise, lithium, it's obviously, Australia is a large lithium producer out of WA, as I guess we know, and it's often associated, my understanding, without a big background knowledge, is with a lot of the felsic igneous provinces over there. Older provinces, albeit, than we have in Queensland. But I think in Queensland, perhaps we've sort of had that, we've been spoiled with all of our other mining activities, such that lithium, being a relatively new kid on the block in the last 5 or 10 years, I guess, hasn't had its attention in Queensland. So I think it's something that there's potential here, but I wouldn't comment more than that, purely on my lack of knowledge about the types of deposits. As to your second comment, or more a question, I guess, Rick, about the what is the route to more discoveries, and on the back of that, building of a mining industry of critical minerals in Queensland. I think it's partly a matter of timing, and the market sort of ebbs and flows, and is very much a momentum driven beast, I guess you would call it. And we're starting to find that in the last 5 years, is that, for example, funding is starting to flow into critical metals, and people are starting to be aware of them. And I guess that was one of the drivers behind the project, looking at the New Economy Minerals compilation here in Queensland, that you set up, Rick, about encouraging people and building their knowledge base as to how these things occur, where the critical metals, what sort of rocks and terrains they're in, and where they might be found. So I think that knowledge base is now building. And the other very interesting thing, I guess, that's happening that I think will be pushing those discoveries along is the change from critical metals explorers being these tiny little junior companies with very little funding, sort of niche market, that their share price rockets and then tumbles about in the same order of time. But I think what we're finding now is critical metals companies are starting to move into that mid-tier range. For example, I know there's an Australian company called Jervois Metals who are into the cobalt market, and they started off as a tiny little explorer with a few resources, but they're now entering that mid-tier stream. So I think once it hits the mid-tier, then there's going to start being a lot more money flowing into exploration. And in Queensland, it's incredible potential here in Queensland. So I'm sure those discoveries will start coming along. So I guess in answer to your question, what can be done? Well, I think the sorts of programs that we've been doing, and put that in context with the general broader development in the critical metals exploration industry, will push those discoveries along.
Thanks, Paul. I might pass over to James now. So Lynette already mentioned that you and your team have actually successfully developed a technology, spun it out into a company, received CRCP funding for that technology, and are continuing to sort of work on that. We have, as part of the complex ore bodies program, this is getting away from critical metals a little bit, but as part of the complex ore bodies program, we're actually looking at going down that route with some other technologies as well. So I'd be interested to hear, your advice to people who are going through that process, to somebody who's just about to embark on the same journey.
Okay, yeah, sure. So I guess when I first came to University of Queensland, my early career research grant with the university was just about a new way of refining a mixed hydroxide, and so that's Queensland Nickel at the time had an ammonia leach refining process to dissolve this intermediate nickel cobalt product, and it wasn't super efficient. There were a lot of issues and challenges with it, and it wasn't most cost effective. So I guess we were working on that for a bit and saw all the problems, and found a way of selectively dissolving the nickel and making a clean separation of the cobalt and manganese, instead of trying to put everything in solution and then deal with all three metals at the same time in solution and all the impurities at the same time. So it's overall, it's just more efficient to do it the other way. So that the separation was clean and fast, and then so it was novel. So we filed some patents for that. Promoted the technology at the right technical conferences for over a number of years. Got feedback. Invested quite a bit of just kind of personal time, I guess, in doing lots of work over a while. And the efficiency of the separation was always there, but for a number of years, I think that, the nickel market went up and down, and then 2013 went down, and things got exciting for 1 year and then kind of went quiet. And then I guess overall the clincher was that we ended up getting lucky with the timing and the rise of the batteries. And I guess the technology was suitable for quickly flipping nickel over into nickel sulfate, which goes into batteries, and it just streamlines the whole supply chain in a sense. So I think that and the rise of demand for nickel sulfate, and so that then attracted investment. We were supported with UniQuest through that. So UniQuest, when I went to the workshop when I started as an employee at UQ, and they just said, oh, it's a great chance you do the hard yards of innovation, and we'll support you, and then you can enjoy the fruits of your labor if you're successful. Basically, is the promise. And unlike working in a company where that's actually not the case, so it seemed like a nice opportunity. So for me, that was exciting. So and they were supportive, but they don't do everything. You've got to kind of push them, and you've got to make sure you're pushing the idea that you have confidence in, I guess, in first instance. But then after that, then they'll do the best to help typically. So they've been pretty great, I would say. I don't know if there are any other specific question. I guess I can try to answer. Yeah.
No, that's fine. I've got a few more that I can come back to you with, but I was just interested to, because it is, and it's also, that sort of pathway is something that the federal government's very keen to see universities do more of as well. So it's been, great to see that.
Yeah, maybe I'll put in maybe one more comment. Yeah, just I guess before coming to the university system, I worked in a number of different industry R&D kind of positions, and so I guess before you jump right into it, it's good to make sure you're at least well informed of the current state of the art, I suppose, if you're going to try to make a development and then go into and go out there and promote an alternative idea and stuff. There's always pushback and criticism, and you have to be able to kind of know where you stand and know all the other options, basically, so you can clearly stand up for your technology. Yeah. Thanks.
Okay, Lynette, I had another one, but yeah, I was gonna ask you a question. So imagine a scenario where you've been lobbying the Queensland government for a year, and one day they call you and say, look, you've broken us down. We want to go ahead with this. We want to take your advice on what we do next. But the only problem is you can only choose one thing to go ahead with. So what would you choose first? I guess it's another way to say, what's your feeling of the best, if you're going to choose one downstream initiative that Queensland should pursue, what would it be?
Oh, gosh, pretty hard, really. So I'll just put this in the context of something else, though, is part of the conversation that I've had has actually led me to gather together all of these companies that come from mining companies all the way through to small little companies that do installations on rural places of lithium-ion batteries, et cetera. And having brought them all together, they're very different companies. There are miners, and then there are tech companies, and then there are retailers. And the one thing which is really interesting between all of them, there's around 20 to 30 people that we talk to now relatively regularly, is that they all feel the same pain. So they're all looking for visibility. They're all looking for support from universities. They're all looking for support from the government. And the one thing which is kind of interesting about all of this is that two things. Firstly, they've started talking to each other, which they hadn't been doing before. So the company that is going to be making aluminium-ion batteries is now talking to the company that is considering making lithium-sulfur batteries. Now, you would think that there was a little overlap there because they're different chemistries. But in a production process, you still need a production line, and perhaps they can get together and create something that, well, probably shouldn't be saying that actually. But anyway, So they've started talking to each other. So you need to find something in this process which actually goes through the whole line. So you look for the thing that is the most obvious, and the most obvious at the moment is electrification of vehicles. And the biggest metal that is, or the two biggest actually metals that are probably the most constrained in terms of supply would be nickel and cobalt, because they form the basis of all of the battery chemistries that are projected to be in dominance over the next 10 years. So if to start, I would start with nickel and cobalt, which, kind of James has done so fantastically over the last few years, because we do have this great tech. We do have access to ores, maybe not as fantastic as what they have in Western Australia, but we do have access. And we do have now this supply chain which is starting to form. So it can form the sort of foundation block of those, how you can actually create the sort of core foundational purpose of that whole supply chain.
Great, thanks. What I thought I'd do now, so we've got about a little bit more than 10 minutes left. Before I go on to the next question, is actually open the questions to the floor. Does anybody want to ask a question of any of the panelists? And I might ask someone, Steve, you're right there in front of me. Can you be the microphone, Walla? Oh, thanks. And we've got another microphone here, which is kind of very, very analog. It's got a cable attached to it. So I'll just, if somebody can hold it there, and I'll try not to trip over it. Do we have any questions from the audience or comments? And I'll just sort of duck over here to make sure there's no questions online.
It's one from Pascal here. It's good. Are you going to get my step count up?
Question for Lynette. Fascinating. And how do you remember all these numbers? There are at least 20, 25 numbers. Do you think it's too far-fetched to ask the Queensland government to integrate the whole complex around closing down coal mines in the next 10, 20 years into these new hydrogen strategies? Wouldn't that be a great opportunity for circular economies?
So
I think it's on. It's just you have to. It'll be heard online, but it just doesn't amplify the same as that other microphone. So if you just speak up, that's all.
Okay, I'll speak up. Speak up. I've had that conversation. I've started the conversation a long time ago on the coal story, not on the basis that we needed to stop doing coal, but more on the basis that it might not be Queensland's decision. Other countries would make the decision around coal, and while we would continue to sell to countries that wanted coal, we needed to be in a position to be able to respond quickly if the international scenario was to change. So the interesting thing
Right up to the mouth.
have found, the interesting thing that I've found is that the Queensland government isn't ignorant of the risks that are out there. But it helps when you actually start to talk about other options. It really is nice to actually offer a comprehensive story about what might be an alternative, because you will hear many people talk about, many coal miners talk about the fact that they're not wedded to coal. It's just that it's here. If you can offer me a transition path to getting somewhere else, then I'll come with you. So that's my discussion with them has actually tended not to focus on the coal, because that just creates a much harder conversation. The better conversation is, hey, we've got these options and we should be pursuing them, because it's a contingency plan, or it's an alternate plan, or it's a transition plan. I mean, any of these words actually give people hope that there is a whole new option out there, which is quite, it's seriously an opportunity. It's not just a whim and a prayer that might happen if the stars align.
Yeah, hi, Lynette. It's interesting what you were saying about the nickel in that in Queensland, and sorry, also, I guess, for you and Paul. I noticed in Leonora's presentation this morning, she really emphasized the importance of copper in a way of reducing CO2. And where do you think, what's your understanding of copper in Queensland, and how important, and why isn't that one of the minerals?
Yeah, look, Andre, I guess we know that certainly historically copper has been incredibly important in Queensland, certainly particularly up around the northwest Queensland, where there are a lot of copper and gold and lead and zinc deposits. It's interesting when you look at all of those, all the copper resources that are sitting out there, and Rick showed them, or maybe Alan showed them on a slide this morning. All of those copper resources that are sitting out there, but not moving forward for a certain reason or not. And it's really interesting when you look at, and copper mines are typically big mines, okay. That's the way a lot of the world's copper supply comes from what's called porphyry copper type deposits, and they're very large open pit mines. And they take a long while to get going. But if you look at the copper mines that have come online relatively quick, they've all been high grade copper mines and reasonably accessible. And I think of things, you know, the Mount Isa copper mines are high grade. Things like Prominent Hill, which was found in South Australia and brought online very quickly because it was a good grade and there weren't any of those complicating factors. So I think that, and there's certainly companies exploring in Queensland for those types of deposits, and Queensland has a history of high-grade copper deposits. So I think it's going to feature pretty prominently in Queensland's future over the next 20 years, but hopefully will be coming to meet some of that pent-up demand. And the one other thing I would add is that we talk about these big mines, but what I think there is a big future for is a lot of smaller mines. You know, big companies don't tackle them because they say we can't afford the management time to have 10 small mines rather than one big mine. But if we can get over that hurdle, and part of it might be autonomous activity and remote management, if we can get over the hurdle of those types of mines, then you know, there's certainly scope to bring a lot of those mines into production to meet that copper demand. Because I see those plots and I know how long it takes for mines to come online. 12 or 13 years is the average at the moment. You know, trying to meet that demand, people talk about 2040, 2050, which is only 20, 30 years away, is going to be a really, really big ask.
Do we have any other questions? I don't have any online currently, so.
No one wants to keep me fit and healthy, walking down the steps. Yeah. I guess I have a question, which is, I can envisage a future where we're successful in establishing some of these new industries, but then we are effectively in competition with some of our neighbouring nations who have bigger economies of scale, like China. And I was really intrigued to hear how you described, Lynette, the EU looking to us to broaden where it can get its resources from. If in the future, you know, we arrive at a point where we have an established industry, but then we're in market competition, I can see some risks there that, you know, China could effectively undercut. What's your opinion, your feel for how competitive we would be, and also what the global will is to genuinely have a diverse source for these metals?
There's nothing to turn it on. You just have to keep it close to you.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think both North America and Europe have recognized that supply chain security is actually a pretty important thing. And certainly Europe's Raw Material Alliance, the US's
this resilient supply chain strategy. I don't know if it's a strategy yet, it's a think piece, is really about making sure that there are multiple routes to get to, to market. And so, yes, we may find ourselves in competition with a number of countries, but in both Europe and in North America's case, the stated objective is for countries that are stable, secure, old friends. In fact, I think the US resilient supply chain says something about like-minded countries they want to be associated with. So in many respects, what we have in Australia and specifically in Queensland is old relationships to the supply chains. We've focused over the last 20 years merely on the extraction side. We have skills to be able to compete in the manufacturing side because we've done it. We've done a lot of the manufacturing. We do a lot of chemical manufacturing. We've just talked ourselves out of the ability to be able to be competitive. We think we can't be competitive, but there isn't a single one of the companies that I speak to that would actually say that we can't compete on labor rates, on any of the above, because most of it is actually associated with the technology and your response to the competition that's coming down the line, rather than on how many laborers you've got running around your processing plant. So all of them point to not labor rates as the issue, but support from government as the issue. And if we kind of get ourselves in the position where government is supporting to a certain extent, and you've got this overlay of universities tightly integrated with the industry, you're able to respond to things as they change as fast as you need to, so that you've got something when the next range comes through. So we're quite capable of competing. We've got an awesome research sector. In fact, we've probably exported far too much of our research in the past. I mean, we've done it multiple times. So it's really about finding a will to keep it onshore rather than just to let it go.
Thanks, Lynette. We've got time, I think, for one more question, and I might give that one to James. In fact, I was going to ask all of you this, but I think we're going to run out of time. So what I want you to do is imagine 2030 or 2031, 10 years from now, what's the best possible world? And let's not confine ourselves to Queensland. Let's think about us, in Australia. Where would you see our sort of critical minerals processing? Where would you like to see our critical minerals processing ability, all the way from, what you do to further downstream?
Yeah, I'd like to. I guess I'd like to see that get started, see some of these things coming through from things, resources that are getting mined, processed, and then going to value-added products which are used domestically and being exported to the world. So I guess I'm a metallurgical engineer by training, and I came to the research center in Australia with BHP, and then after the financial crisis, they kind of shied away from downstream processing. Was kind of essentially not on the back burner for a number of years, but clearly there's a lot of pressure building up now, and so I think it's time to go to those next steps, and so I'd like to just see it happen and be part of it, I guess, over the coming years. And I think
And in your area, is there something that you could see as being transformative happening in that time that that kind of sets the whole area of the sort of extractive hydromet work on its ear in that area?
Yeah, I think there's this around in nickel and cobalt. There's the pure battery technologies. The company that spun out, they've implemented things industrially already. There's plans for things in Queensland that would be very exciting if that type of thing could happen, and it could be part of a battery manufacturing hub. All the components, you got all the metals, all the expensive parts of the things. You got graphite. You just if you get some industry, I think the trick is to get some seed. You got to get a couple of things actually kind of going, and then it's like a crystallization. You got to nucleate, and then it can grow. it's super saturated at the moment. So so we just gotta find a way to get it going. So I'm hopeful that that can happen. I think that'd be good for Queensland. It's good. There's a lot of there's high level of technical ability in the state. There's a lot of technical training. That could all be focused in a certain direction if there's an industry pull for it.
Thanks, James. And you always do start these things thinking, oh God, an hour is a long time for us to spend on this, but I feel like we could have gone for another half an hour very easily. So could you all just join me in thanking the panel for their contribution? Thanks very much. Okay.